Introduction to shading. Purpose and importance of shading. Shading is a crucial aspect of drawing that brings your artwork to life by adding depth, dimension, and realism. Its primary purpose is to simulate how light interacts with the surfaces of objects, creating the illusion of three-dimensional form on a two-dimensional plane. Understanding and applying shading techniques effectively can transform a flat sketch into a dynamic and engaging piece of art. 1. Enhancing depth and dimension. Shading helps to convey the three-dimensional form of objects and characters. By depicting how light falls on different surfaces, shading creates a sense of depth and volume. For instance, shadows can make it clear whether an object is protruding or recessed, enhancing the overall realism of your drawing. This is especially important in character design, where accurate shading can highlight features like muscles, folds in clothing, and facial expressions. 2. Creating realistic textures. Different textures are represented through shading. Whether it's the smoothness of skin, the roughness of fabric, or the metallic sheen of an object, shading helps to illustrate these textures realistically. Understanding how light interacts with various surfaces enables you to render different materials convincingly, adding richness to your artwork. 3. Establishing mood and atmosphere. The way you use shading can significantly influence the mood of your drawing. Dark, heavy shading can create a dramatic or somber atmosphere, while lighter shading can produce a more uplifting or serene feel. By controlling the intensity and direction of shadows, you can set the emotional tone of your artwork and guide the viewer's perception. 4. Focusing attention. Shading can be used to draw attention to specific areas of your drawing. By strategically placing highlights and shadows, you can guide the viewer's eye to important features or focal points. This technique is particularly useful in character design, where you might want to emphasize certain aspects of the character's face or outfit. Overview of different shading techniques. There are several shading techniques that artists use to create different effects and textures in their drawings. Each technique offers unique advantages and can be used to achieve specific artistic goals. Understanding these techniques will help you choose the right approach for your drawing of Lucy from Cyberpunk. Here's an overview of some common shading methods. 1. Hatching. Hatching involves drawing a series of parallel lines to create areas of shadow. The density and direction of the lines can be adjusted to represent varying degrees of darkness and texture. Cross-hatching, where lines intersect, can be used to create deeper shadows and more complex textures. This technique is effective for creating linear texture and can be adapted for various styles. 2. Stippling. Stippling uses dots to create shading and texture. The density and arrangement of the dots determine the darkness of the shaded area. Stippling can create a soft, textured look and is useful for rendering subtle gradations of light and shadow. It's a time-consuming method but can produce intricate and detailed results. 3. Blending. Blending involves smoothing out pencil strokes to create a gradient of tones. This technique can be achieved with blending stumps, fingers, or even tissue. Blending is ideal for achieving smooth transitions between light and shadow, making it suitable for rendering realistic skin textures and soft, gradual shadows. 4. Scumbling. Scumbling is a technique where you use a loose, circular motion to apply pencil marks. This creates a texture that can be used to represent rough surfaces or to blend areas of shading. Scumbling is particularly useful for adding texture to fabric or creating organic, natural textures in your drawing. 5. Smudging. Smudging involves using a tool or your finger to blur pencil marks, creating a soft, smooth effect. This technique can be used to create subtle gradients and to soften harsh lines. Smudging is effective for blending shadows and achieving a more fluid, cohesive shading effect. 6. Gradation. Gradation refers to the smooth transition between light and dark areas. This technique is often achieved through blending and is important for creating realistic representations of light and shadow. Gradations can help to define the contours of your subject and create a sense of volume. 7. Chiaroscuro. Chiaroscuro is an Italian term meaning light dark, and refers to the use of strong contrasts between light and dark areas to create a dramatic effect. This technique is effective for emphasizing the three-dimensionality of your subject and can be used to create a striking visual impact. 8. Coarse shadow and cast shadow. Understanding coarse shadows, the darkest part of the shadow on an object, and cast shadows, the shadow cast by an object onto another surface, is essential for creating realistic shading. Coarse shadows help define the form of the object, while cast shadows add to the overall depth and realism of the drawing. By mastering these shading techniques, you will be able to create more dynamic and lifelike drawings of characters like Lucy from Cyberpunk. Practice and experimentation with these methods will allow you to develop your own style and approach to shading, enhancing the overall quality of your artwork. Basic shading techniques. Hatching. Single and cross hatching. Hatching is a fundamental shading technique where lines are drawn in parallel to build up areas of shadow. This method can vary in density, direction, and spacing to create different effects. Understanding hatching is crucial for rendering various textures and forms in your artwork. 1. Single hatching. Single hatching involves drawing parallel lines in a consistent direction. The closeness and number of lines determine the darkness of the shaded area. For lighter shadows, you can space the lines farther apart, while closer lines will create a darker, more intense shadow. Application. Use single hatching to depict simple, uniform textures and to add depth to flat surfaces. It's useful for creating preliminary shadows and defining basic forms. Experiment with line direction and spacing to see how it affects the shading and texture. Tips. Maintain consistent line pressure for even shading, and use a ruler for straight, uniform lines if needed. For a smoother effect, keep the lines parallel and avoid abrupt changes in line direction. 2. Cross-hatching. Cross-hatching builds upon single hatching by adding a second layer of lines intersecting the first layer. This technique creates more complex textures and deeper shadows by varying the angle and density of the intersecting lines. Application. Use cross-hatching to add depth and dimension to areas where light and shadow interact more intricately. It's effective for creating rich textures and detailed shading in complex forms, such as folds in clothing or detailed facial features. Tips. Vary the angle of the intersecting lines to achieve different effects. Lighter cross-hatching will result in subtle shading, while more intense cross-hatching can create strong contrasts. Practice layering lines to find the right balance for your desired effect. Stippling. Dot placement and density. Stippling involves using dots to create areas of shading. The density and arrangement of the dots dictate the overall darkness and texture of the shaded region. This technique can be particularly effective for creating intricate details and smooth gradients. 1. Dot placement. The placement of dots in stippling is essential for controlling the shading. Dots should be evenly distributed where light is less intense and more concentrated in areas requiring darker shading. Application. Use stippling to achieve a soft, textured look in areas like skin or fabric. It's useful for detailed and delicate shading where a smooth gradient is desired, such as in the subtle shadows on Lucy's face or clothing. Tips. Control dot density by adjusting your pen or pencil pressure. For a smoother gradient, gradually increase the dot density from light to dark areas. Be patient, as stippling can be time-consuming but rewarding for detailed work. 2. Density. The density of the dots affects the shading's depth. Sparse dots create light shading, while dense dots produce darker, more intense areas. Application. Vary dot density to create gradations and textures. For example, a densely stippled area might represent a shadowed section of Lucy's outfit, while a lighter stippling could indicate a highlight or lighter area. Tips. Avoid overloading areas with dots, as this can create a cluttered look. Practice varying dot sizes and spacing to see how they affect the shading and texture. Blending. Smooth transitions and tools. Blending involves smoothing out pencil strokes to create seamless transitions between light and dark areas. This technique helps to achieve a more natural and realistic look in your shading. 1. Smooth transitions. Blending is used to transition smoothly between different tones, eliminating harsh lines and creating a gradient effect. It is ideal for rendering smooth surfaces and subtle shading. Application. Use blending to create soft shadows and transitions on loose skin or clothing. This technique helps in achieving a realistic representation of light and shadow by making the shading appear more cohesive. Tips. Start blending from the lighter areas and work toward the darker areas. Use a gentle hand to avoid smudging or creating uneven patches. Practice controlling the pressure and direction of your blending to achieve the desired effect. 2. Tools for blending. Several tools can be used for blending, including blending stumps, fingers, and tissues. Blending stumps. These are cylindrical tools made of compressed paper or felt that help in smoothing out pencil marks. They are useful for creating detailed and controlled blending. Fingers. Using your fingers can create a softer, more organic blend. However, be cautious of smudging or transferring oils from your skin to the paper. Tissues. Tissues or soft cloths can be used to blend larger areas or achieve a smooth, even texture. They are particularly useful for blending large expanses of shading. Tips. Clean blending tools regularly to avoid transferring graphite from one area to another. Experiment with different tools to find the one that works best for your style and the effect you want to achieve. By mastering these basic shading techniques, hatching, stippling, and blending, you'll be able to create detailed and dynamic drawings of Lucy from Cyberpunk. Each technique offers unique possibilities for rendering textures and shadows, enhancing the overall quality and realism of your artwork. Understanding light sources. Types of light sources. Understanding different types of light sources is essential for accurately depicting light and shadow in your drawings. Each type of light source affects how light interacts with objects, creating distinct shadows and highlights. Here's a breakdown of the main types of light sources. 1. Directional light. Directional light comes from a single, identifiable source, such as the sun or a spotlight. It casts shadows that are well defined and follow the direction of the light. This type of light creates strong contrasts between light and dark areas. Application. Use directional light to create dramatic shadows and highlights. For instance, if you're drawing Lucy in a scene with strong sunlight, you'll need to consider how the sunlight casts long, sharp shadows and creates bright highlights on her features. Tips. Pay attention to the angle and position of the light source relative to your subject. This will help you place shadows and highlights accurately. Directional light is useful for emphasizing form and creating a bold visual impact. 2. Ambient light. Ambient light is diffused and comes from multiple sources, creating soft, even illumination with minimal shadows. It's the light that fills in the gaps where direct light doesn't reach, often found in overcast conditions or indoor settings with indirect light. Application. Ambient light is useful for rendering a more subtle and even lighting effect. When drawing Lucy in a dimly lit environment or indoors, ambient light will ensure that shadows are softer and highlights are less intense. Tips. Use ambient light to soften shadows and reduce the contrast between light and dark areas. This can help in creating a more natural and uniform look, especially in scenes with diffused or indirect lighting. 3. Point light. Point light sources emit light in all directions from a single point, such as a lamp or candle. This type of light creates sharp, focused shadows that spread out from the source, with a pronounced fall-off as distance from the light increases. Application. Point light is ideal for creating dramatic, localized effects. When drawing a scene with a single light source, like a street lamp or a spotlight, use point light to render focused illumination and sharp, defined shadows. Tips. Consider how the intensity and distance of the point light affect the shadows. Shadows will be darkest closest to the light source and gradually fade out. Use this effect to add depth and focus to specific areas in your drawing. 4. Spotlight. Spotlight is similar to directional light but with a focused beam, creating a conical shape of light. It's used to highlight specific areas while leaving others in shadow, often seen in theatrical or stage lighting. Application. Use spotlight to draw attention to certain features or areas of your subject. This can be useful for emphasizing parts of Lucy's outfit or face, creating a spotlight effect that draws the viewer's eye to a particular area. Tips. Pay attention to the fall-off of light intensity from the center to the edges of the spot. This gradient effect will help in achieving a natural and realistic lighting effect in your drawing. How light affects form and shadow. Understanding how light affects form and shadow is essential for creating realistic and dynamic drawings. The interaction between light and form determines how shadows are cast and how highlights appear. 1. Light and form. Light creates the illusion of three-dimensionality by defining the contours and surfaces of objects. The direction of the light source affects how highlights and shadows are distributed across the form. Application. Observe how light interacts with different surfaces. For example, a round object like Lucy's head will have a gradual transition from light to shadow, while a flat surface will have more distinct boundaries between light and dark areas. Tips. Use reference images or observe real-life objects under various lighting conditions to understand how light shapes the form. Practice drawing different forms with varying light sources to develop a keen sense of how light affects your subject. 2. Types of shadows. Shadows created by light sources can be categorized into several types. Cast shadows. These are the shadows that an object casts onto another surface. They are affected by the light source's position and intensity. Cast shadows can be sharp or soft, depending on the light source. Core shadows. The darkest part of the shadow on the object itself, where the light is blocked completely. Core shadows define the depth and volume of the object. Reflected light. Light that bounces off surrounding surfaces and illuminates the shadowed areas, creating subtle highlights within shadows. Tips. Pay attention to the edges of shadows and their transitions. Soft shadows occur with diffuse light sources, while sharp shadows are typical of direct light sources. Practice rendering different types of shadows to understand their effects on your drawing. Creating a light source in your drawing. Incorporating a light source into your drawing helps in establishing a consistent lighting scheme and enhancing the overall realism of your artwork. 1. Determining the light source. Decide on the type and position of the light source before starting your drawing. This will guide your shading and shadow placement throughout the drawing process. Application. For Lucy from Cyberpunk, choose a light source that complements the scene. Whether it's a dramatic, directional light or a subtle ambient light, ensure that it enhances the mood and complements the character's design. Tips. Clearly define the light source in your sketch or preliminary drawing. Use markers or annotations to indicate the direction and intensity of the light to keep your shading consistent. 2. Shading and highlights. Apply shading and highlights based on the light source you've chosen. Ensure that shadows and highlights align with the light source's direction and intensity. Application. Start with the lightest areas and build up to the darker shadows. Use your chosen light source to guide the placement of highlights and shadows on Lucy's features and clothing. Tips. Regularly step back and review your drawing to ensure that the light source is consistent throughout. Adjust shadows and highlights as needed to maintain realism and coherence. By understanding different types of light sources, how they affect form and shadow, and how to effectively create a light source in your drawing, you'll be able to produce more realistic and visually compelling artwork of Lucy from Cyberpunk. Practice and observation will further enhance your ability to capture the nuances of light and shadow in your drawings. Creating depth and dimension. Creating depth and dimension in your artwork involves accurately depicting how light and shadow interact with forms. This not only enhances the realism of your drawing but also adds a sense of three-dimensionality. Here's how you can achieve depth and dimension through effective use of light and shadow. Light and shadow relationships. 1. Understanding light and shadow interaction. The relationship between light and shadow is fundamental to creating depth. Shadows occur where light is obstructed or redirected by the object, and they help to define the contours and volume of the subject. Application. Observe how light sources cast shadows on objects and how those shadows shape the form. For Lucy, consider how the light affects different parts of her body and clothing, such as how the shadows on her arms might differ from those on her face due to the varying angles of light. Tips: use reference images to see how light interacts with different surfaces. Pay attention to the direction, intensity, and quality of light, and replicate these effects in your drawing to enhance depth. 2. Creating contrast. Contrast between light and shadow helps to define the form and create visual interest. Areas of strong light contrast with dark shadows can create dramatic effects, while softer contrasts provide a more subtle, natural look. Application: use strong contrasts for dramatic scenes or to emphasize key features of Lucy. Softer contrasts work well for more subtle, realistic effects, such as creating smooth transitions in her clothing or skin. Tips: adjust the contrast by varying the intensity of your shading. Ensure that light and shadow are balanced to maintain a natural appearance, and avoid overusing high contrast unless it's intentional for the effect. Core shadows, cast shadows, and reflected light. 1. Core shadows. Core shadows are the darkest part of the shadow on the object itself, where light is completely blocked. They define the object's form and depth by illustrating how light is obstructed. Application: apply core shadows to areas where the object curves away from the light source or where light is blocked entirely. For Lucy, core shadows will help define the contours of her face, body, and clothing. Tips: place core shadows where the object turns away from the light. Blend them gradually into lighter areas to create a natural transition from dark to light. 2. Cast shadows. Cast shadows are the shadows that an object projects onto other surfaces. They vary in shape and intensity depending on the light source's position and the object's form. Application: use cast shadows to indicate the relationship between Lucy and her environment. For instance, if she's standing, her cast shadow on the ground or nearby objects will help to place her in space and provide context. Tips: observe how cast shadows stretch and change shape with different light angles. Ensure that the cast shadows correspond to the light source and the object's position. 3. Reflected light. Reflected light occurs when light bounces off nearby surfaces and illuminates the shadowed areas of an object. It adds subtle highlights within shadows and contributes to a more realistic look. Application: add reflected light to shadowed areas of Lucy's drawing to create depth and a more natural appearance. For example, if she's near a light-colored surface, the reflected light can soften the shadows and add detail. Tips: use a lighter pencil or shading technique to add reflected light gently. Avoid making reflected light too strong. It should be subtle and complement the overall shading. Using gradients to add depth. 1. Creating gradients. Gradients are smooth transitions from light to dark that help to depict depth and volume. They are achieved through blending or shading techniques that create a gradual change in tone. Application: apply gradients to areas where light transitions smoothly, such as the curvature of Lucy's face or the folds of her clothing. Gradients help to illustrate the three-dimensional form and create a realistic effect. Tips: practice blending techniques to achieve smooth gradients. Use a blending stump, tissue, or your fingers to ensure a seamless transition between light and dark areas. 2. Layering and building up tones. Gradients can be built up gradually by layering and adjusting the tone. Start with lighter tones and gradually add darker shades to create depth and dimension. Application: for a realistic gradient, start with light shading and progressively add more layers of darker tones. This method helps to create a natural and coherent depth effect in your drawing. Tips: work in layers to control the gradient smoothly. Avoid harsh lines or abrupt changes in tone by blending thoroughly and adjusting your shading as needed. By understanding light and shadow relationships, and effectively using core shadows, cast shadows, reflected light, and gradients, you'll be able to create depth and dimension in your drawings of Lucy from Cyberpunk. These techniques will help you achieve a more realistic and visually engaging representation of your subject. Textural shading. Techniques for different textures. Shading different textures requires understanding how various surfaces interact with light. Here's how to approach shading for common textures such as skin, clothing, and hair. 1. Skin. Skin texture can range from smooth and even to rough and varied, depending on factors like lighting and the character's condition. Technique. Use soft, blended shading to depict smooth skin. Gradually build up layers to create subtle gradients, mimicking the natural transitions between light and shadow. For areas like wrinkles or pores, use finer lines and detailed shading to capture these features. Tips. Avoid harsh lines or overuse of texture in areas where smoothness is needed. For more detailed work, lightly stipple or cross-hatch to indicate skin texture without making it look too rough. 2. Clothing. Clothing can have various textures such as fabric, leather, or metal. Each type requires a different shading approach to capture its unique surface characteristics. Technique. For fabric, use smooth, flowing lines and soft gradients to depict the way light falls over folds and creases. For leather, use a mix of smooth shading and subtle texture to convey its sheen and surface. For metal, highlight the reflective quality with sharper contrasts and smooth transitions. Tips. Study the specific fabric or material you're drawing to understand how it interacts with light. Pay attention to details like highlights on folds or reflections on smooth surfaces. 3. Hair. Hair texture varies from smooth and shiny to coarse and voluminous. The shading technique should reflect the type of hair you're drawing. Technique. Use long, flowing strokes or small, controlled lines to represent hair strands. Blend smoothly for shiny, straight hair and use more defined strokes for curly or textured hair. Layering shades helps to build volume and dimension. Tips. Pay attention to light direction and how it affects hair highlights and shadows. For realistic hair, vary your shading to reflect light and create depth, making sure to capture the natural flow and volume of the hair. How to convey texture through shading. Conveying texture through shading involves using various techniques to mimic the appearance of different surfaces. Here's how to achieve this. 1. Understanding surface properties. Different surfaces reflect light differently. Smooth surfaces, like glass or polished metal, reflect light sharply and clearly, while rough surfaces, like stone or fabric, scatter light more diffusely. Application. For smooth textures, use soft gradients and minimal texture. For rough textures, incorporate varied line work or stippling to represent surface irregularities. Tips. Observe real-life textures and use reference images to guide your shading. Practice capturing the unique characteristics of each texture in your drawings. 2. Using contrast and detail. Texture is often conveyed through a combination of contrast and detail. High contrast can indicate a polished, reflective surface, while detailed, intricate shading can represent a textured surface. Application. Apply high contrast for glossy or reflective materials and detailed shading for more tactile textures. Adjust the level of detail based on the texture's complexity. Tips. Balance contrast and detail to avoid overemphasizing texture or making it appear unnatural. Practice different textures to develop a keen eye for achieving realistic effects. Practical exercises. 1. Shading simple geometric shapes. Objective. Practice applying shading techniques to basic geometric shapes to understand light, shadow, and texture. Exercise. Draw basic shapes such as spheres, cubes, and cylinders. Use different shading techniques to represent various light sources and textures. Experiment with hatching, stippling, and blending to achieve realistic shading. Tips. Focus on observing how light affects each shape differently. Pay attention to core shadows, cast shadows, and highlights, and practice creating smooth gradients and contrasts. 2. Applying shading techniques to basic forms. Objective. Apply shading techniques to more complex forms by combining basic shapes and textures. Exercise. Create a still life drawing or a simple scene incorporating multiple forms, such as a piece of fruit, a cup, or a simple character pose. Use the shading techniques learned to depict different textures and lighting conditions. Tips: combine different shading techniques to capture the complexity of the scene. Observe how different textures interact with light and adjust your shading approach accordingly. By mastering textural shading techniques and practicing with simple geometric shapes and basic forms, you'll enhance your ability to create realistic and dynamic drawings of characters like Lucy from Cyberpunk. These exercises will help you apply shading effectively, capturing the unique textures and forms in your artwork. Introduction to adding details. Importance of details in enhancing realism and character. 1. Enhancing realism. Details are crucial for bringing a drawing to life. They add depth, texture, and specificity that help in creating a realistic portrayal of the subject. Small details like wrinkles, textures, and intricate patterns contribute significantly to how lifelike and believable the drawing appears. Application. When drawing Lucy, adding details such as the texture of her clothing, the shine in her eyes, and the subtle folds in her hair will make the drawing more realistic and engaging. Details help in portraying her unique characteristics and bringing out the personality of the character. Tips. Focus on the key details that define the subject's look and personality. Avoid overwhelming the drawing with excessive details. Instead, prioritize elements that enhance the character's realism and emotional expression. 2. Adding character. Details also contribute to the character and mood of the drawing. They can convey emotions, age, and other personality traits that define the subject's individuality. Application. Incorporate unique features and stylistic elements that reflect Lucy's character. This might include the specific style of her clothing, distinctive facial expressions, or particular accessories that add to her identity. Tips. Use details to enhance the character's story and background. Pay attention to how these details align with the overall narrative or setting of your drawing. Balance between detail and overall composition. 1. Ensuring cohesion. While details are important, they should not overshadow the overall composition of the drawing. Achieving a balance ensures that details complement rather than dominate the artwork. Application. When adding details, consider how they fit within the overall composition. For example, ensure that intricate patterns or textures do not detract from the focal points of your drawing, such as Lucy's face or key features. Tips. Use details strategically to enhance focal areas while maintaining harmony throughout the composition. Evaluate the overall balance and make adjustments to ensure that the details integrate smoothly with the rest of the drawing. 2. Avoiding over-detailing. Over-detailing can lead to a cluttered and visually overwhelming drawing. It's important to focus on areas that benefit from additional detail while maintaining simplicity where necessary. Application. Apply detailed rendering to important areas such as the face and key features, while keeping other areas more abstract or less detailed. This helps in directing the viewer's attention to the main elements of the drawing. Tips. Regularly step back and assess your drawing as a whole. Determine if any areas are overly detailed or if additional detail might be needed to balance the composition. Drawing facial features. Detailed rendering of eyes, nose, and mouth. 1. Eyes. The eyes are often the focal point of a portrait and play a crucial role in conveying emotion and personality. Technique. Focus on capturing the shape, size, and placement of the eyes. Render the iris and pupil with careful attention to detail, including highlights and reflections that add depth. Use shading to depict the eyelids, and create subtle lines and textures around the eyes to enhance realism. Tips. Observe how light interacts with the eyes and apply shading accordingly. Pay attention to the unique characteristics of Lucy's eyes and replicate them in your drawing for authenticity. 2. Nose. The nose is central to facial structure and requires accurate proportions and shading to integrate with the rest of the face. Technique. Draw the nose with attention to its shape and how it connects to the face. Use shading to depict the nasal bridge, nostrils, and the areas where light falls and cast shadows. Subtle shading can help in creating the illusion of depth and form. Tips: study the proportions and anatomy of the nose to ensure accurate representation. Use light and shadow to define its shape and enhance its three-dimensional appearance. 3. Mouth. The mouth contributes significantly to facial expressions and character portrayal. Technique: detail the shape of the lips, including the curves and lines that define their form. Use shading to show the folds and creases in the lips and to indicate how light and shadow interact with them. Pay attention to the subtle variations in tone that reflect the natural texture of the lips. Tips: observe how the mouth moves with different expressions and replicate these nuances in your drawing. Ensure that the mouth aligns with the overall expression and mood of the character. Understanding proportions and placement. 1. Proportions. Accurate proportions are essential for creating a realistic and believable face. The positioning and size of facial features should align with established proportions to achieve a harmonious look. Technique: use guidelines and reference points to ensure that features like the eyes, nose, and mouth are proportionate and correctly positioned. For instance, the eyes are typically placed halfway down the head, and the distance between the eyes is approximately one eye's width. Tips: regularly check proportions as you draw and make adjustments as needed. Use reference images or grids to help maintain accurate proportions and placement. 2. Placement. Proper placement of facial features is crucial for capturing the character's likeness and expression. Technique: align facial features according to the established proportions and ensure that they fit within the overall structure of the face. Pay attention to how features like the eyes and mouth align with the facial structure and expression. Tips: use light sketching to position features accurately before finalizing the details. Make adjustments based on the character's expression and pose to ensure natural placement. Adding texture and subtle shading. 1. Adding texture. Texture adds realism to facial features by mimicking the surface quality of the skin and other elements. Technique: use fine lines, stippling, or gentle shading to indicate texture in areas like the skin, lips, and eyes. Pay attention to small details such as pores, wrinkles, and the subtle variations in skin texture. Tips: apply texture subtly to avoid overloading the drawing. Focus on key areas where texture adds realism and depth, and keep other areas smooth for contrast. 2. Subtle shading. Subtle shading helps in creating a smooth transition between light and shadow, enhancing the three-dimensional appearance of facial features. Technique: use light, gradual shading to blend shadows and highlights seamlessly. Avoid harsh lines or abrupt changes in tone, and use blending tools to achieve smooth transitions. Tips: build up shading gradually and use blending techniques to create a natural, cohesive look. Pay attention to how light affects different areas of the face and adjust shading accordingly. By focusing on details, proportions, and texture, you'll be able to create more realistic and expressive drawings of Lucy from Cyberpunk. These techniques will enhance the overall quality of your artwork and bring out the character's personality and depth. Texturing clothing and accessories. Techniques for fabric textures. 1. Wrinkles and folds. Fabric textures such as wrinkles and folds add realism and depth to clothing in your drawings. Understanding how to render these textures effectively enhances the believability of the clothing. Technique: identify the light source, determine how the light interacts with the folds and wrinkles. Light creates highlights on raised areas and casts shadows in the deeper folds. Draw the basic shapes, sketch the primary lines of the folds and wrinkles first. Focus on how the fabric gathers and drapes. Add shading. Use smooth, gradual shading to depict how light and shadow play on the fabric. Darker shading represents deeper folds, while lighter shading indicates raised areas. Tips: observe real fabric or reference images to understand how different types of fabrics fold and wrinkle. Practice drawing various types of fabric to capture their unique characteristics. 2. Patterns and textures. Patterns and textures on fabric, such as stripes, checks, or textures like denim, add complexity and interest to clothing. Technique. Draw the pattern. Begin by sketching the basic pattern on the fabric. Ensure that the pattern follows the folds and contours of the clothing. Add texture. Use shading techniques to emphasize the texture. For example, create a sense of weave or grain in fabrics like denim or wool by adding subtle linework or stippling. Tips. Ensure that patterns align correctly with the fabric's folds and shape. Use light and shadow to integrate patterns into the fabric's texture, ensuring they appear naturally part of the clothing. Shading metallic and reflective surfaces. 1. Metallic surfaces. Metallic surfaces reflect light differently than matte surfaces, requiring specific shading techniques to capture their shiny, reflective quality. Technique. Highlight and shadow. Focus on creating sharp highlights where light directly hits the metal and deep shadows where light is obstructed. The contrast between these areas enhances the reflective quality. Blending. Use smooth gradients to blend the transitions between highlights and shadows, mimicking the way light reflects off a curved metal surface. Tips. Observe how light interacts with real metallic surfaces. Pay attention to the sharpness of highlights and the smoothness of gradients to capture the reflective nature accurately. 2. Reflective surfaces. Reflective surfaces, such as glass or polished objects, require a careful approach to shading to depict their transparency and reflections. Technique. Reflections. Incorporate reflections of surrounding objects or light sources in the reflective surface. Use light shading and gradients to simulate transparency and depth. Highlight and shadow. Apply highlights and shadows based on the object's curvature and the light source. Reflective surfaces often have high contrast and subtle color shifts. Tips. Ensure that reflections are consistent with the surrounding environment. Use soft blending to achieve the transparent effect and avoid harsh lines. Hair detailing. Rendering different hair textures and styles. 1. Hair textures. Hair can vary from smooth and straight to curly and voluminous. Each texture requires a different approach to shading and detailing. Technique. Straight hair. Use long, flowing strokes to represent individual strands. Blend smoothly to capture the shine and softness of straight hair. Curly or wavy hair. Apply a mix of curved strokes and shading to convey the texture and volume. Emphasize the curl pattern and create shadows to indicate the hair's movement and body. Tips. Observe the specific texture of hair you're drawing. Use reference images to understand how light and shadow interact with different hair types. 2. Hair styles. Different hairstyles require distinct shading and detailing techniques to capture their unique appearance and structure. Technique. Detailed styles. For complex hairstyles, break down the hair into manageable sections. Render each section with attention to the flow and volume, using layered strokes to build up texture. Simple styles. For simpler hairstyles, focus on basic shapes and smooth shading. Ensure that the hairstyle complements the character's overall look and expression. Tips. Practice drawing various hairstyles to develop versatility. Pay attention to how the hairstyle frames the face and enhances the character's personality. Techniques for highlighting and shading hair strands. 1. Highlighting hair strands. Highlights are essential for creating the illusion of light reflecting off hair, adding realism and depth. Technique. Identify light source. Determine where the light source is and apply highlights accordingly. Use a lighter pencil or eraser to create bright streaks on the hair strands. Layer highlights. Build up highlights gradually, blending with the surrounding hair to create a natural transition. Tips. Use varying levels of lightness to capture the natural shine of the hair. Avoid overdoing highlights. Subtlety is key for realistic results. 2. Shading hair strands. Shading helps in depicting the depth and volume of hair, contributing to the three-dimensional appearance. Technique. Apply base shading. Start with a light base shade to define the overall tone of the hair. Gradually build up darker shades to create depth and dimension. Use directional strokes. Shade hair strands in the direction of their natural flow to enhance realism. Blend shadows smoothly to avoid harsh lines. Tips. Focus on creating smooth transitions between light and dark areas. Use blending tools to achieve a cohesive look and emphasize the natural flow of the hair. By mastering texturing techniques for clothing and accessories, and refining your approach to hair detailing, you'll be able to create more lifelike and dynamic drawings of Lucy from Cyberpunk. These skills will enhance your ability to depict various textures and styles effectively, contributing to a more polished and realistic final artwork. Finishing touches. Adding final details and highlights. 1. Adding final details. The final stage of drawing involves refining the details to enhance realism and ensure that every aspect of the drawing is well defined and complete. Technique. Refine textures. Go over areas like clothing, hair, and facial features to add any last-minute details that enhance texture and depth. Add fine lines, subtle shading, or small details that may have been missed earlier. Enhance features. Focus on key areas such as the eyes, mouth, and any distinct elements of Lucy's attire. Ensure that all essential features are crisp and clearly defined. Tips. Take breaks and return to the drawing with fresh eyes to spot any areas that need refinement. Use a magnifying glass or zoom in to ensure precision in fine details. 2. Adding highlights. Highlights bring out the lightest parts of your drawing, adding realism and depth to the final piece. Technique. Use white pencil or gel pen. Apply a white pencil or gel pen to add bright highlights where light hits the surfaces most intensely. This could include areas such as the shine on hair, the glint in the eyes, or reflections on metallic surfaces. Create contrast. Use highlights to create contrast with darker areas, emphasizing the three-dimensionality of your drawing. Tips. Apply highlights sparingly to avoid overdoing them. Focus on areas where light naturally creates the most contrast. Layer highlights gradually to achieve a smooth and realistic effect. 3. Balancing overall detail with the drawing. Balancing detail. Ensuring that the level of detail complements the overall composition is crucial for a cohesive final piece. Technique. Evaluate composition. Assess the drawing as a whole to determine if any areas have too much or too little detail. Balance the level of detail across different parts of the drawing to maintain harmony and focus. Adjust as needed. Make adjustments to areas that seem too busy or too plain. Blend or simplify details to achieve a balanced and cohesive look. Tips. Use a step-back approach to review the drawing from a distance. This helps in identifying areas that need adjustment and ensures that the overall composition is visually appealing. Practical exercises. Detailed study of Lucy from Cyberpunk. 1. Study Lucy's features. Conduct a detailed study of Lucy, focusing on her unique characteristics, attire, and style. Exercise. Reference analysis. Use reference images of Lucy to analyze her features, clothing, and hairstyle. Pay attention to details such as facial expressions, textures, and patterns. Sketching practice. Create detailed sketches of different parts of Lucy, focusing on capturing her likeness and the intricate details of her design. Tips. Compare your sketches with reference images to ensure accuracy. Practice drawing various elements separately before integrating them into the final composition. Applying detailed techniques to different parts of the drawing. 1. Detail application. Apply the detailed techniques learned throughout the course to different sections of the drawing to enhance realism and cohesion. Exercise. Section focus. Work on specific parts of the drawing, such as the eyes, clothing, or hair, applying detailed shading, texture, and highlights to each area. Ensure that each section is well defined and integrates smoothly with the rest of the drawing. Review and adjust. Continuously review the drawing as you add details, making adjustments to ensure that each part harmonizes with the overall composition. Tips. Focus on one section at a time to maintain quality and consistency. Regularly step back to assess the overall balance and make necessary refinements. By focusing on finishing touches and practical exercises, you'll be able to refine your drawing of Lucy from Cyberpunk, enhancing the overall quality and ensuring that all details contribute to a cohesive and realistic final piece.